Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we tackle a single relevant question based on our Bible reading for that day. And this week our reading is centered around the book of 1 Corinthians. Today I'm joined by Zack Unkenholz and Chris Rexroad, and our question is from our reading in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. And as a matter of fact, I talked about this yesterday. I couldn't remember if it was in the podcast that we were going to do this week. But it says, when one of you has a dispute with another believer, how dare you file a lawsuit and ask a secular court to decide the matter instead of taking it to other believers? Don't you realize that someday we believers will judge the world? And since you are going to judge the world, can't you decide even little things among yourselves? Don't you realize that we will judge angels? So you should surely be able to resolve ordinary disputes in this life. If you have legal disputes about such matters, why go to outside judges who are not respected by the church? I am saying this to shame you. Isn't there anyone in all the church who is wise enough to decide these issues? But instead, one believer sues another right in front of unbelievers. Even to have such lawsuits with one another is a defeat for you. Why not just accept the injustice and leave it at that? Why not let yourselves be cheated? Instead, you yourselves are the ones who do wrong and cheat even your fellow believers. So the question that I want to ask is, should we seek to settle legal disputes inside the church? If so, how do we do that? And I want to say out of the gate that I do not believe that this is addressing criminal activity. I believe it's speaking of civil litigation only. You owe me money. You encroached on my property. Those kind of things.
The things you'd see on Judge Judy.
Yeah, so sometimes those could be criminal, but do you watch Judge Judy regularly?
All the time, every day. No.
Okay.
Not really.
When I was younger, it was Judge Wapner.
Oh, okay.
As a matter of fact, I think he was the first one. It was called the People's Court.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I have heard of that. You're going to get whopped. That was the saying, right?
I don't think so. Somebody took his place, but I believe it's speaking specifically about civil matters, not criminal matters here. So I want to say that out of the gate before we go further in the discussion. So in case somebody tries to take this out of context, they don't do that. So I think he's talking about civil matters. So should we seek to settle legal disputes inside the church? If so, how should we go about that?
Well, I would say yes, if possible. I think that the church, in my experience, has avoided that for a long time, that people just pretty much go straight to the courts. But I mean, the picture that I'm seeing here is from the outside looking in as an unbeliever, seeing these people professed as Christians. They can't even seem to be getting along, and they're going to the courts to settle their disputes instead of working it out amongst each other. Why in the world would I join a group of people that can't even handle these matters? So I think that's one of Paul's biggest concerns right there. But for us to handle it in church, I mean, I would say that you'd probably want to have a group of people that would come together and overhear what's going on and help them work it out if the however many parties are involved are willing to listen and work with one another. But it's touchy.
I mean, every family has disputes, and the family of God is no different, and I think that with your family, you would not take your siblings to court or cause a lot of trouble.
That's probably not the first option.
Not typically would not be, I think you'd want to settle it with your family, because you love them. And if you love somebody, typically you wouldn't want to get them in more trouble, but you'd want things to be right. We all want justice. God is a God of justice. I think it's something he actually puts in us. But I think that out of love, and respect for our fellow, believers in Christ, our family in Christ, we should try to do it in a way that doesn't hurt a lot of people. We're not trying to hurt them in some way, and settle it like believers, settle it like Christians. But that's not always easy, and sometimes even, avoiding the people, and having those conversations maybe saves us. We think, oh, it's going to save us trouble with them if we take ourselves out of the situation a bit and get the outside involved. But I think that it leads to a lot less bloodshed, when we handle it just together in a biblical way.
There's several pieces to this that I think he talks about. One, he says we should do it because in the end we're going to judge the world. We're going to judge angels, which is, quite the statement. But he also says maybe the best case is for you just to suck it up and
Drop it.
drop it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Just suffer, because it complicates things. Someone recently asked me a question about a friend was wanting to borrow some money from them, a large sum of money. And I said, they asked, what should I do? And I said, well, you have to ask yourself a couple of questions. One, if they don't pay you back, are you willing to take the steps necessary to get the money? And when I say a large sum of money, it was a whole lot of money. And I said, because there is some possibility that you could lose a friend over this. Do you want to lose a friend over this? And they were processing it, because if either, and I learned at a young age, I would rather give you money than loan you money. If you come and ask me to borrow money, I'm probably going to say no. But if I can give it to you, I'll give it to you, because then I don't think about it.
Mhm.
Anything that puts up walls in between believers is complicated. It complicates the relationship. But how you settle them, who would you go to? So those are the kind of questions I've tried to process. Do you go to the pastor? I don't want to be the judge every time I hate being in the middle, and sometimes I'm caught in the middle of things like, why did you, did I have something written on my forehead that said, come talk to me about this? I want to, and I got questions for God anyway, already. And, so I don't want him to come to me. Is it the elders that decide these disputes? How common, how frequent are they? For the most part, I would think, for the most part, certain things they would have disputes about are a little bit more clarified today, like property lines, for example. We've got surveys and boundary markers, and they had boundary markers, but it's a little bit clearer today,
Yeah.
that it's recorded. So I would think that would be some of the disputes. You borrowed my donkey and didn't bring him back, and if he's not branded, who does he belong to? Even, and we find this, this model is an Old Testament model. What he's saying here is not something new. This is not a new concept, because that's what Moses was weary from the long line of people who he was having to judge for. And Jethro tells him, what you need to do is break it down and make people over groups of 50, 100, 1,000, whatever, 10, 25, 50, whatever, and let them decide. And then if they can't decide, bring it to you. So apparently there were a lot of disputes. And we can see this all the way to Solomon, so they come to Solomon with the baby. There's a dispute between the two of them. One's dead, the other one's living, and he's like, cut the baby in half, and so this concept of disputes being settled in the church is it's not something new that Paul's just introducing here. I believe the big thing he's trying to say is that it hurts our testimony for Christ when these things roll out into public. When we file lawsuits in a public court and we go testify in a public court, and there are newspapers or whatever written about it. I think that my brain just went sideways because I had like 3 things I thought about right at one time. I think he's trying to say, be careful that you don't allow the testimony of Christ to be ruined over something that happened between you and another brother. You're better off just to suck it up. That's what I read. Suck it
to
up.
To reiterate, you're talking about civil matters.
Civil matters. That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, doing these things, not going to court.
Yeah, and I would even say at times would be criminal situations. Maybe you would do that. If I took your watch,
jail. It's immediately.
You're probably not going to send me to jail. Probably not.
No, because this thing's about 5 years old.
Yeah, but
if it was
you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah,
physical acts of violence, those kind of things. That's different.
Yeah,
they're completely. They should be reviewed different, responded to differently.
Yeah.
And I think anything I'm getting into with criminal behavior would be dangerous for me to say you should or shouldn't.
Right.
You have full right to report anything that is criminal behavior. But civil behavior, I think that is. I think sometimes we're better off to just swallow our pride or our pain or our hurt and deal with it than to roll it out in public. From a civil standpoint, not a criminal standpoint. Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue our conversation around 1 Corinthians.